A fruit company overthrew a government. Not a metaphor, not a conspiracy theory. A real corporation that sold bananas decided a democratically elected president had to go, and the United States helped make it happen. The year was 1954. The country was Guatemala. The crime? Trying to buy land that wasn't being used. Guatemala's president wanted to purchase empty farmland and give it to starving peasants. The company said no. So his government was destroyed. A dictator was installed. And a chain reaction began that would leave 200,000 people dead. All because of bananas. This wasn't a Cold War accident. It wasn't about communism. And it wasn't about freedom. It was about land, power, and profit. This is the most absurd regime change in American history. And almost nobody talks about it. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you see American foreign policy forever. Here's what we're covering. First, how a fruit company became more powerful than most governments. Second, the president who tried to fight back. Third, how the CIA manufactured a fake invasion. And finally, why this one operation in 1954 created a template America would use again and again for the next 50 years. This is the story of Operation PBSUCCESS, the CIA's first coup, the one that proved you could overthrow a democracy and get away with it. Let's start with the company, the United Fruit Company. By 1950, it was one of the most powerful corporations on Earth. Not because of innovation, not because of technology, because it owned entire countries. Here's how it worked. United Fruit grew bananas in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Colombia, wherever the climate was right and the governments were weak. But they didn't just grow bananas, they owned everything. The railroads. United Fruit built them, so United Fruit controlled them. The ports. United Fruit built those too. The telegraph lines, the shipping routes, the electricity in some towns. If you wanted to move anything in Guatemala, you went through United Fruit. If you wanted to communicate with the outside world, you went through United Fruit. If you wanted to export anything, you paid United Fruit. The locals had a name for the company, El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles were wrapped around everything. But here's the part that made it truly obscene. United Fruit owned 550,000 acres of Guatemalan land. That's over 850 square miles, more than twice the size of New York City. And they only farmed about 15% of it. The rest just sat there, empty, unused. While Guatemalan peasants starved because they had no land to grow food. Why keep land you're not using? Simple, control. If United Fruit owned all the farmable land, nobody else could compete. No local farmer could start a banana operation. No rival company could move in. United Fruit had a monopoly, and empty land was how they kept it. Meanwhile, 2% of Guatemala's population owned 70% of the land. Most people had nothing. They worked on plantations for poverty wages, or they starved. This was Guatemala in 1950, a country that existed to grow bananas for American breakfast tables. A country where a foreign corporation had more power than the government. And then something unexpected happened. Guatemala held a free election. His name was Jacobo Árbenz. He was 37 years old. A military officer turned politician, handsome, charismatic, elected president in 1951 with 65% of the vote. Arbenz wasn't a radical, he wasn't a communist despite what you might have heard. He was a capitalist who believed in private property and free markets. But he also believed something dangerous. He believed Guatemala should benefit Guatemalans. Arbenz looked at his country and saw the obvious problem. A tiny elite owned everything. Foreign corporations extracted the wealth. The majority of people lived in medieval poverty. His solution was simple, land reform. Take unused land from the biggest landowners. Pay them for it. Redistribute it to 500,000 poor farmers. Let people grow their own food. Build a middle class. Modernize the economy. This wasn't revolutionary. The United States had done similar things during the New Deal. Japan did it after World War II. It was basic economic development. But there was one problem. The biggest landowner in Guatemala was the United Fruit Company. And United Fruit did not want to sell. In 1952, Arbenz signed Decree 900, the land reform law. Here's how it worked. The government would expropriate unused land from large estates. Owners would be compensated with 25-year government bonds. The price would be based on the land's declared tax value. That last part is important. The declared tax value. See, United Fruit had been lying on their taxes for years. They told the Guatemalan government their land was worth almost nothing, so they could pay almost nothing in taxes. Now that trick backfired. Arbenz offered to pay United Fruit $1.2 million for their unused land. That was the value United Fruit had declared. United Fruit demanded $16 million instead. Arbenz said, no, you said it was worth $1.2 million. That's what I'll pay. This was the moment everything changed. United Fruit had a choice, accept the money and lose their monopoly, or fight back. They chose to fight. Now here's where the story gets dark. United Fruit didn't just have money, they had connections. The kind of connections that could overthrow governments. Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, had been a lawyer for United Fruit. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, had also been a lawyer for United Fruit. Both brothers owned stock in the company. The Assistant Secretary of State, former United Fruit Board member, the head of the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division, married to the personal assistant of United Fruit's CEO. This wasn't a company lobbying the government. This was a company that had infiltrated the government. The people deciding American foreign policy were the same people who profited from United Fruit's monopoly. And those people had a solution to the Arbenz problem. If Guatemala's president wouldn't protect United Fruit's profits, Guatemala would get a new president. The propaganda campaign started immediately. United Fruit hired Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, the man who literally wrote the book on propaganda, to sell a story to the American public. The story was simple. Jacobo Árbenz was a communist. It wasn't true. Arbenz was a nationalist who wanted to modernize his country. The CIA's own internal assessments admitted he wasn't controlled by Moscow. But truth didn't matter. Perception mattered. Bernays planted stories in American newspapers. He flew journalists to Guatemala on United Fruit's dime and showed them what he wanted them to see. He created fake grassroots organizations that warned about the communist threat in Central America. The New York Times ran the stories. Time magazine ran the stories. Members of Congress gave speeches about the danger of communism spreading to America's backyard. Nobody mentioned that the real issue was a fruit company that didn't want to pay taxes. Nobody mentioned that the land being seized was empty land that United Fruit wasn't even using. Nobody mentioned that Arbenz had won a free and fair election with 65% of the vote. The narrative was set. Guatemala was going communist. America had to act. By 1953, the CIA had a plan. They called it Operation PBSUCCESS. The goal was simple: overthrow Arbenz and replace him with someone who would protect American business interests, someone who would give United Fruit back its land, someone who would crush any future attempts at reform. The budget was $2.7 million, a tiny amount to destroy a democracy. The method was clever. The CIA wouldn't invade Guatemala directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would create the illusion of an invasion. They would recruit a small army of Guatemalan exiles, train them in Honduras, arm them with American weapons, and then march them toward Guatemala City. The army didn't need to actually win. It just needed to exist. Because the real weapon wasn't soldiers. It was fear. If you're still here, you're about to see how the CIA perfected the art of regime change. Now let's reveal the actual operation. The fake radio broadcasts, the psychological warfare, the moment Arbenz realized his own military had betrayed him, and the 40 years of horror that followed. This was just the setup. The takedown is next. June 8th, 1954.
And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
They had old rifles, a few trucks, no air support to speak of. They were facing a Guatemalan military of 6,000 trained soldiers. On paper, it should have been a massacre. The invasion should have been crushed in hours. It wasn't, because the invasion wasn't the weapon. The invasion was a distraction. The real weapon was already inside Guatemala, and it was about to tear the country apart. The CIA called it psychological warfare. Here's how it worked. A few weeks before the invasion, mysterious radio broadcasts started appearing on Guatemalan airwaves, a station calling itself the Voice of Liberation. The broadcasts claimed to be from inside Guatemala. They claimed to represent a massive rebel movement. They reported on troop movements, army defections, rebel victories. All of it was fake. The radio station was broadcasting from Honduras. The rebel army was 400 poorly trained mercenaries. The reports of military defections were complete fabrications. But Guatemalans didn't know that. And more importantly, the Guatemalan military didn't know that. The CIA understood something crucial about power. Power isn't just about guns and soldiers. Power is about perception. If people believe you're strong, you're strong. If people believe you're weak, you're weak. Arbenz had 6,000 soldiers. But did those soldiers believe in him? Did they trust each other? Would they fight for a president the United States had labeled a communist? The CIA's job was to make them doubt. Every day, the fake radio station reported new defections. Generals turning against Arbenz. Units refusing to fight. The rebel army growing stronger. None of it was true, but how could anyone verify it? The phone lines were unreliable. The telegraph was compromised. Commanders couldn't confirm what was happening in other parts of the country. All they had was the radio, and the radio was telling them they were already losing. Then came the air attacks. The CIA had provided the rebels with a few World War II fighter planes. Nothing impressive, just enough to drop bombs and strafe targets. The planes hit Guatemala City. They bombed a military base. They destroyed a fuel depot. The damage was minimal, a few buildings, a handful of casualties. But the psychological impact was massive. Guatemalans saw planes attacking their capital. They heard explosions. They assumed a real invasion was underway. And Arbenz's military commanders started doing the math. If the United States was behind this, fighting back was suicide. America had endless planes, endless bombs, endless resources. Guatemala had nothing. Why die for a president who was already doomed? Arbenz tried to rally his military. He called his commanders. He ordered them to stop the invasion. He told them the rebel army was tiny, weak, beatable. He was right. The rebels were outnumbered 15-1. They had almost no ammunition. Several units had already gotten lost in the jungle. One good counterattack would have ended the whole thing. But the counterattack never came. The commanders hesitated. They stalled. They requested more information, more time, more assurances. And then, one by one, they started making private calculations. If Arbenz fell, what happened to officers who had supported him? If the Americans were really behind this, which side did they want to be on? On June 25th, 1 week into the invasion, Arbenz called an emergency meeting with his top military commanders. He asked them directly, "Will you fight?" The room was silent. Then the chief of the armed forces spoke. He told Arbenz the military would not defend the government. He suggested the president resign. Arbenz understood. His own army had been turned against him, not by the rebels, by fear, by American pressure, by the CIA's psychological operation. He had 6,000 soldiers, and none of them would fight. On June 27th, 1954, Jacobo Árbenz went on national radio. He announced his resignation. He told the Guatemalan people the truth, that the United States had organized the invasion, that United Fruit was behind it, that foreign powers had decided Guatemala could not choose its own leaders. Then he walked out of the presidential palace. He would spend the rest of his life in exile. Mexico, Switzerland, France, Cuba. He died in 1971, broken and alcoholic, in a bathtub in Mexico City. He was 57 years old. The man who replaced him was named Carlos Castillo Armas. He was the leader of the rebel army, a colonel who had failed at multiple coup attempts before the CIA recruited him. Not particularly smart, not particularly capable, but willing to follow orders. Within days of taking power, Castillo Armas showed who he was working for. He reversed the land reform. Every acre that had been redistributed to poor farmers was returned to the original owners. United Fruit got back all of its land. He banned labor unions. He outlawed political parties. He arrested thousands of suspected Arbenz supporters. The secret police started disappearing people, teachers, journalists, anyone who had supported the previous government. Democracy was over. But here's what the CIA didn't anticipate. You can overthrow a government in 9 days. You can install a dictator in an afternoon. You cannot delete the memory of what people almost had. For one brief moment, Guatemalan peasants had owned land. They had grown their own food. They had believed their country might belong to them. Now that was gone, and they remembered who took it. What followed was 40 years of civil war. 1960, military officers rebel against the government. The insurgency begins. 1966, the first death squads appear, right-wing paramilitaries funded by the government. 1970s, the violence escalates. Entire villages massacred, bodies dumped in ravines. 1980s, the worst of the genocide. The military launches a scorched earth campaign against Mayan communities suspected of supporting the rebels. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. 200,000 people killed. 45,000 disappeared, taken by security forces and never seen again. 1 million displaced from their homes. 626 villages completely destroyed. The CIA's own documents later admitted that the Guatemalan military committed acts of genocide. All of it traces back to 1954, to Operation PBSUCCESS, to a fruit company that didn't want to pay for land it wasn't using. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. Guatemala wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The CIA looked at Operation PBSUCCESS and saw a template, proof of concept, evidence that you could overthrow governments cheaply, quietly, without sending American troops. 1953, Iran. The CIA helped overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh after he nationalized oil. Same playbook. Propaganda, psychological warfare, military pressure. 1961, Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Same concept, but it failed. Turns out the template didn't work everywhere. 1964, Brazil. Military coup supported by the CIA. 20 years of dictatorship followed. 1973, Chile. Salvador Allende overthrown. Augusto Pinochet installed. Thousands killed and tortured. The list goes on. Congo, Indonesia, Vietnam, Nicaragua. Every time American corporations or strategic interests were threatened, the Guatemala playbook came out. Create a narrative, fund an opposition, apply pressure until the government breaks. The United Fruit Company still exists, by the way. They changed their name in 1984. Now they're called Chiquita Brands International. You've probably bought their bananas. In 2007, Chiquita admitted to paying $1.7 million to Colombian paramilitary groups, organizations that murdered thousands of people. They paid a $25 million fine. Nobody went to prison. The company that overthrew Guatemala is still selling fruit. Here's what 1954 teaches us. Democracy is fragile. It can be purchased, manipulated, and destroyed by people who never appear on any ballot. The reasons given for intervention are almost never the real reasons. Communism was the excuse in Guatemala. The reality was a fruit company's profit margins. And the consequences of regime change don't end when the operation succeeds. They echo for generations. 200,000 dead in Guatemala. Entire communities erased, a country that still hasn't recovered. All because one president tried to buy some empty land. Jacobo Árbenz wanted to build a middle class. He wanted Guatemala to be a normal country where people could own property and feed their families. For that, he was called a communist. For that, his government was destroyed. For that, his country burned for 40 years. The bananas kept flowing north. The profits kept flowing to Boston. And Guatemala learned what happens when you threaten the wrong company. They called it Operation PBSUCCESS, the CIA's first successful coup, the template for everything that came after. All of it, the death squads, the disappeared, the genocide, started with a company that sold fruit and a government that did its bidding. Remember that next time you buy bananas.